There's a filing cabinet's worth of clay tablets, and none of them agree with what most people think a flood myth should sound like. A king stands beside a reed wall, not speaking to a person, listening to one. The gods have already voted. Mankind is finished quietly in a closed session no mortal was meant to hear about. One god disagrees, but he's sworn silence, an oath even a god cannot simply break. So he doesn't. He finds the only gap wide enough to matter, and he speaks through it. Not to a man, to a wall, and the man beside it is listening. The tablet is unremarkable to look at. Tan clay, cracked along one edge, small enough to fit in a palm. Filed today under a museum accession number most visitors walk past without a second glance. But the writing on it is not unremarkable. It may be the oldest surviving account of a flood that erases nearly all of mankind. And the people who wrote it did not call it a myth. They called it a record. Scholars group it with other texts under names like the Atrahasis Epic, the Sumerian king list, and fragments known as the Eridu Genesis. The copies that survive are mostly Old Babylonian, inked around 1700 BCE by scribes working in cities like Nippur and Sippar. But the copyists said, plainly, in the texts themselves, that they were transcribing something older. Stories already ancient by the time a reed stylus pressed into wet clay to record them again. Some fragments reach back toward the 3rd millennium BCE, closer to the founding of the first Sumerian city-states than to us. This is what historians actually mean when they say, the oldest flood story ever recovered. Not Noah, not Deucalion. This. What makes it strange isn't the flood itself. Floods appear in the mythology of nearly every culture that ever lived near a river capable of drowning them. The Yellow River, the Nile, the great rivers of Mesoamerica. A flood, on its own, tells you almost nothing. What makes this account strange is the shape of the warning inside it, how it moves, who is allowed to hear it, and why it can't simply be spoken aloud. The story opens with noise, not water. Mankind has grown loud. There's no talk of sin here, no catalogue of cruelty the way later traditions would frame it. Just noise, humanity multiplying across the plain between the Tigris and Euphrates until the clamour of ordinary human life becomes unbearable to the god Enlil, who cannot sleep. This isn't metaphor smoothed in by a later poet. The tablets present it as something closer to administrative fact, the kind of complaint a bureaucrat might file against an overcrowded district. The population has outgrown what the land, and the patience of its rulers, was ever built to hold. Enlil brings the complaint to the assembly of gods, and here the record stops sounding like myth and starts sounding like a legal transcript. The gods do not act in a fit of rage, they convene, they discuss. Scholars have compared the mechanism directly to Mesopotamian court proceedings, where verdicts were reached through deliberation among a body, not handed down as the singular decree of one furious ruler. First, the assembly sends drought, then plague, both engineered to thin the noise without ending humanity outright. Neither works. The population recovers within a generation. The noise returns exactly as before. So the assembly moves to its final measure, a flood, engineered specifically to finish what disease and famine could not. Notice what this decision is not. It is not chaotic. It is not sudden divine fury lashing out at a single provocation. It is a deliberated verdict, reached collectively, executed with what the tablets frame as procedural finality. A ruling with no appeal built into its structure, no minority report, no dissent recorded as anything but overruled. And built into that same structure, almost as an afterthought, sits a second decision. Quieter than the first, harder to notice on a first reading. No god may warn a mortal of what is coming. The assembly does not simply vote to flood the earth. It votes, in the same breath, to keep that flood a secret from the species it will destroy. That second clause is the hinge everything else turns on. Because one god present in that assembly disagrees. Enki, god of wisdom, of fresh water, of the crafts that let cities survive at all. Some versions of the text have him object on the grounds that punishing every household for a failure attributed to noise is disproportionate, that guilt should fall on individuals, not on a species. It doesn't matter. He's overruled. The verdict stands exactly as written, and Enki does not walk out of that assembly free to act on his objection. He walks out bound by it, bound by an oath the texts treat as entirely real, enforceable. something not even a god of his particular stature can simply set aside because he disagrees with the outcome. And that oath, specifically, now forbids him from telling any mortal in any form what the assembly has decided. Sit with that for a moment, because it reframes everything that follows. We're used to warning stories where the hero simply speaks. A prophet stands in the street and says what's coming. An angel appears at the foot of a bed. Here, the mechanism is broken from the very outset of the story. The one figure with both the knowledge and the will to save someone is explicitly, textually, prevented from doing the one thing that would actually save them, speaking directly to a person. Scholars translate the relevant oath language cautiously, aware that a single Sumerian or Akkadian term can carry legal, ritual, and cosmic weight simultaneously that no English word fully captures on its own. But the functional outcome is unambiguous across every surviving version of this story. Enki knows exactly what is coming. Enki wants someone, anyone, to survive it. And Enki is not permitted to say so, and yet someone did survive. The tablets are not vague on this point, not hedged the way a later invented detail might be. A man named Ziusudra, in later Akkadian versions called Utnapishtim, later still echoed as Noah, builds a boat and lives, presented as settled fact, transmitted, copied, and preserved for over 1,000 years by scribes who had no obvious reason to invent an unnecessary complication like a divine gag order if the story worked exactly as well without one. So how does a warning ever reach the one man who needs to hear it? If a god is bound by oath not to speak, and the assembly's verdict is absolute, how does anyone survive at all? The tablets answer this with a detail so specific, so oddly staged, that it has puzzled translators for over a century. Because Enki does not break his oath. He finds the seam running through it, and the record says plainly that he found that seam standing beside a wall. Ziusudra is a king and a priest in the city of Shuruppak. He has a reed hut on the riverbank, the kind of structure so ordinary it turns up in the archaeological record by the thousands. Woven marsh reed, plastered with river mud, the standard building material of southern Mesopotamia for millennia, before anyone thought to bake a brick. Not a temple, not a palace. A wall indistinguishable from the one beside it, and the one beside that. And it is next to this wall, not in front of Ziusudra, not through a vision, though dreams were an accepted channel between gods and mortals elsewhere in this same literary tradition, that Enki chooses to speak. The tablet's phrasing has puzzled translators for exactly this reason. Enki does not address the king. He addresses the wall. Some translations render the line with unnerving precision. Enki speaking to the reed wall of the house, instructing it to listen, as though the wall itself were the intended recipient of divine speech, with the king merely positioned to overhear something that was never technically said to him at all. Is this sloppy translation smoothing over an awkward metaphor? Assyriologists don't think so. They keep returning to this passage because it functions like a loophole, and it reads like one too. Read the oath again, carefully. It forbids a god from warning a mortal. It does not forbid a god from speaking near one. So if Ziusudra merely happens to be standing on the far side of a wall his god is addressing, has Enki broken his oath? Or has he found the one gap in its wording wide enough to save a household through? The tablets never resolve this ambiguity, and that refusal to resolve it may be the most telling detail in the entire account. A later scribe, copying a story already this old, had every opportunity to simplify the scene. Gods appear directly to mortals constantly elsewhere in the same body of literature, in dreams, in visions, face to face. Instead, across multiple independent copies spanning centuries and different scribal schools working in different cities, the wall persists. The specificity survives the retelling intact. In textual scholarship, that kind of consistency across independent transmission lines usually means one thing. The detail mattered enormously to whoever told it first, enough that generations of copyists preserved an oddity they could easily have written away. What comes through the wall, spoken to it or merely overheard beside it, the text refuses to specify which, is not vague. It's administrative again, the same procedural voice used earlier to describe the assembly's verdict itself. Take heed, the wall is told. Pay attention. A flood is coming that will sweep over the cult centers and destroy the seed of mankind. That is the entire warning a species' survival will hinge on. Not thunder, not a burning bush, not a chariot of fire descending from the sky. A message routed through architecture, addressed to a structure incapable of hearing anything at all, so that a king standing nearby might happen to receive it second-hand. Why him, specifically? The tablets do not call Ziusudra a random survivor, plucked from the general population by accident. He is named as the last king of Shuruppak before the flood, a figure the Sumerian king list places at the tail end of an already mythologized dynastic sequence. Kings, the list claims, who reigned for tens of thousands of years before the deluge reset the clock on human history entirely. Later tradition remembers him specifically as a priest devoted to Enki, which may explain the choice of household more plausibly than piety alone. A god constrained from speaking to any mortal might still, within whatever the text imagines as the letter of that law, find himself standing near the one mortal already positioned to listen, his own priest, tending his own shrine, beside his own wall. There is something almost bureaucratic in how carefully the narrative threads this particular needle, and that bureaucratic carefulness is exactly what should give a modern reader pause. This is not a story chasing miracle for its own sake. It is a story obsessed with constraint, with what a powerful, well-intentioned being can and cannot do once bound by a rule higher than his own private judgment of what's right. Enki does not overturn the assembly's verdict. He does not free mankind from the flood. He does not save more than a single household. What he does instead is narrower and stranger. He preserves the letter of an oath while quietly gutting its purpose, using the only mechanism the text seems to think was actually available to him: proximity, architecture, a message aimed on paper at silence itself. Ziusudra on the other side of that wall understands immediately. The tablets record no confusion on his part, no negotiation, no hesitation, no request for clarification about what any of it means. What they record instead is action, specific, already underway, described in a level of practical detail that reads less like a myth's vague gesture toward salvation and more like a construction order handed to an actual shipbuilder. Because that, in the version of the story that follows, is exactly what Enki provides him next. What the tablets describe next reads like a shipwright's log, not scripture. And that specificity is itself part of what makes the account so unsettling to modern readers, expecting vague, symbolic instructions. The boat Ziusudra is told to build is not some undefined ark drifting through undefined waters. The Atrahasis version gives measurements. It specifies the vessel should be roofed over completely, sealed, built with equal length and width, a design closer to a covered barge or a cube than to the long-keeled ships familiar from later maritime tradition. The instructions call for it to be caulked with pitch and bitumen, materials abundant in southern Mesopotamia, seeping naturally from the ground near ancient Hit on the Euphrates, materials Mesopotamian builders had already used for centuries to waterproof reed boats and brick foundations alike. Nothing fantastical here, ordinary regional technology, applied at an extraordinary scale. Scholars who've studied the specifications have pointed out how strange the resulting shape actually is, for a vessel meant to survive a storm at sea. A cube doesn't sail. It isn't built to cut through waves the way a hull is. It's built to float, sealed, enduring catastrophic water rather than navigating ordinary swells. Whoever composed these instructions wasn't describing a ship meant to go anywhere in particular. They were describing a container built purely to endure. Ziusudra is told to load it with his family, with skilled craftsmen, and with what the text calls the seed of all living things, a phrase scholars translate variously, but which consistently implies breeding stock, grain reserves, and craft knowledge itself, the accumulated technical skill of an entire civilization loaded onto a single sealed vessel. The point, it turns out, was never just saving lives. It was saving the capacity to rebuild afterward, from nothing. And the secrecy that defined the warning itself does not end once Ziusudra understands what's coming. If anything, it deepens. The tablets describe him constructing this enormous, deeply conspicuous project, a sealed cube-shaped vessel large enough to house his household, his craftsmen and breeding stock for every domesticated species his community depends on, while his neighbours watch him build it day after day in plain view. A vessel of that scale, built inland, away from any obvious commercial purpose, would have been impossible to hide physically. So the story doesn't pretend it was hidden physically. What it hides, instead, is the reason. Some versions have Ziusudra offer his fellow citizens a cover story. that he's fallen from one god's favour and into another's protection. A private quarrel among divine patrons, nothing that concerns anyone outside his own household, nothing anyone else needs to prepare for. A lie, built specifically to guarantee the one outcome the Assembly's original verdict was designed to ensure that no one outside this single household would understand what was actually coming, or have any chance to build a vessel of their own. This is the detail that separates the account from a simple rescue story. Ziusudra does not attempt to warn anyone else, even indirectly, even once he possesses the knowledge himself. The text gives no indication he tried and failed. It gives no indication he tried at all. Whatever combination of divine constraint, self-preservation, or narrow obedience to the letter of what he'd been told shaped his behaviour, the outcome recorded across every surviving copy is identical. One household prepared. Every other household in Shuruppak and in every other city the tablets name went on with ordinary life, hearing nothing, suspecting nothing, right up until the storm actually began. And when it began, the tablets do not describe anything resembling a manageable weather event. 6 days and 7 nights of storm, wind and flood together, erasing the distinction between land and water, so completely that even the gods, according to the text, were frightened by the scale of what they'd set in motion. Ishtar is described weeping, lamenting that she had voted for the destruction of her own people in the assembly, horrified at a scale of death she apparently hadn't pictured in the abstract safety of divine deliberation. The other gods, the tablets say, cowered like dogs, crouched against the outer wall of heaven, as though the storm's violence had exceeded what even its own architects had intended it to be. Inside the sealed hull, Ziusudra and his household endure the only way the text tells us anyone did. Enclosed, waterproofed, provisioned, riding out a catastrophe engineered specifically to leave nothing else standing anywhere. Outside, in every direction, the cities that heard no warning simply cease to exist in the narrative at all. Shuruppak is never described being destroyed in any detail. It doesn't need to be. Its complete absence from everything that follows is the detail. One man listened to a wall. Everyone who never got the chance to stand beside one did not survive to tell it. On the 7th day, the storm ends the way it began, abruptly, as though a switch had been reached rather than a weather system finally exhausting itself. Ziusudra opens a hatch in the sealed hull, and the light that reaches him falls on nothing. No horizon, no cities, no coastline anywhere. Just water, flat and total, in every direction the text bothers to describe. He weeps at the sight, and the tablets do not read this as triumph. They read it as grief. A man who has survived, looking out at the empty proof of everyone who did not. The boat eventually grounds on a mountain, later tradition naming it Nimush, somewhere east of Mesopotamia. Ziusudra releases birds to test for dry land. First a dove, then a swallow, both returning, finding nowhere to land, and finally a raven, which does not come back. The sign, in the story's own internal logic, that somewhere beyond sight the water has finally begun to recede enough to matter. This is the detail later scribal traditions carry forward almost unchanged, copied into later Akkadian versions, and carried further still into narratives far outside Mesopotamia entirely, in cultures that, as far as the archaeological record shows, had no direct contact with Shuruppak's scribes at all. What follows is the part of the story that reframes the secrecy itself. Ziusudra performs a sacrifice, and the tablets describe the gods gathering around the offering like flies, a phrase that has struck translators for centuries as startlingly undignified. Divine beings suddenly reduced to hunger, drawn in by the smell of a meal after days without one. And Enlil, the god who first brought the complaint about mankind's noise to the assembly, arrives to find that someone has survived his verdict after all. His anger, according to the text, is immediate and specific, not at humanity, at whichever god broke the silence the entire plan had depended on. This is the moment the oath stops mattering, because the secrecy it enforced no longer serves any purpose at all. Enki, present among the gathered gods, does not deny what he did. He does not hide behind the technicality of the wall the way he hid behind it during the flood itself. Instead, the tablets describe him defending the choice openly, arguing that punishing every innocent alongside the guilty was itself unjust, that Enlil's fury had exceeded justice and become simple destruction. It is, in effect, the same objection Enki raised in the original assembly, except now, with the flood already finished and one household already saved, there is nothing left for the other gods to overrule. The secrecy did its work. The argument that follows is no longer about whether to warn a mortal at all, it is about whether Enki was right to have found the seam in his own oath in the first place. The assembly does not punish him for it. Instead, Ziusudra is granted what no other mortal in the narrative receives: immortality alongside his wife, and a place to live it out far from ordinary human cities. The reward in the end for having been the one man positioned beside the one wall, a god was still permitted to speak to. It's worth returning one last time to the detail that makes this account worth telling at all, and perhaps that is the most unsettling part of the entire tradition. Not the flood, not the destruction, not even the survival of a single household, while an entire civilization disappeared beneath the water. It is the idea that language itself became a battlefield. Every action in the story turns on words, on what may be spoken, what must remain hidden, and what can be implied without ever being said outright. The catastrophe begins with a decision reached through deliberation. The rescue begins with a sentence carefully redirected away from its intended listener. Civilization, in this telling, survives because someone understood that the strictest rules often fail at their edges. That fascination with loopholes was not unique to mythology. Mesopotamian society itself was built upon written agreements, legal contracts, sworn oaths, and carefully defined obligations. Scribes spent years mastering the precise wording of laws because a single phrase could determine the outcome of a dispute over land, inheritance, or justice. The gods of these stories behave remarkably like the societies that imagined them. They negotiate, they assemble, they issue binding decrees, they expect those decrees to be obeyed. Even divine power operates within a framework of rules. Seen from that perspective, Enki's solution becomes more than an act of compassion. It becomes an act of extraordinary intelligence. He does not overthrow the system. He does not challenge the authority of the assembly by force. Instead, he demonstrates that even the most absolute law can contain an unnoticed opening if someone understands its wording well enough. The wall is not simply a clever narrative device. It is the physical embodiment of a legal technicality. It transforms architecture into a witness, and silence into communication. That may explain why later generations of scribes preserved this strange detail with such care. They were not merely copying an old flood story. They were preserving a lesson about wisdom itself. Strength can destroy, authority can command. But wisdom finds the path that neither strength nor authority can see. In Mesopotamian tradition, Enki was never the strongest of the gods. He was the wisest. The story never asks us to admire overwhelming power. It asks us to admire the mind capable of working within impossible constraints. Modern readers often search these tablets for evidence of a historical flood, wondering whether they preserve a distant memory of some catastrophic event that swept through southern Mesopotamia thousands of years ago. Archaeologists have indeed uncovered flood deposits beneath several ancient cities, including Shuruppak, suggesting that devastating regional floods occurred more than once during the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE. Yet no single layer has ever proven the existence of a flood that covered the entire world. The evidence points instead toward local disasters so overwhelming that, to those who experienced them, the destruction may well have seemed universal. If every city you know disappears beneath the water, the distinction between a regional catastrophe and the end of the world quickly loses its meaning. Perhaps that is why this story endured for so long. It was never merely about water. It was about survival in the face of forces no individual could control. Floods shaped Mesopotamian life from the very beginning. The same rivers that nourished fields and sustained the first great cities could also erase them without warning. Every generation understood that prosperity and disaster flowed from the same source. The flood myth gave that uncertainty a narrative, transforming unpredictable nature into a cosmic drama governed by decisions, arguments, and consequences. Centuries later, when Babylonian scribes copied the story again, they did not erase its oldest and strangest features. They adapted names, expanded speeches, and reshaped parts of the narrative, yet the image of the hidden warning survived. Even when the story entered entirely different literary traditions, echoes of its structure remained. A chosen survivor, a divinely instructed vessel, birds sent to search for land, a sacrifice after the waters recede. These familiar elements travelled across cultures and centuries, but the wall, the quiet, almost invisible centrepiece of the oldest account, gradually faded into the background, replaced by more direct conversations between gods and men. Perhaps later storytellers found the loophole unnecessary, or perhaps they found it too strange to preserve. Yet it is precisely that strange detail that makes the earliest version feel unexpectedly human. It understands something timeless about power. Those who create rules often believe they have anticipated every possibility. History repeatedly proves otherwise. Again and again, individuals have survived oppressive systems not by confronting them head-on, but by discovering the narrow spaces those systems overlooked. Thousands of years have passed since the clay tablets were first pressed with a reed stylus. Kingdoms have risen and fallen. Languages have disappeared. Temples have crumbled into dust beneath the Mesopotamian sun. Yet that single image still survives, carried across millennia by generations of anonymous scribes who considered it important enough to preserve exactly as they received it. A god stands beside an ordinary reed wall. He never breaks his oath. He never speaks directly to the man he wishes to save, and yet the message is heard. The flood becomes one of humanity's oldest remembered disasters. The art becomes one of history's most enduring symbols of survival. But before either of those ideas existed, before countless civilizations retold the story in their own words, there was only a wall, a whispered warning spoken to something that could never answer back, and a single listener wise enough to realize that sometimes the most important message is the one that was never meant to be addressed to you at all. This is not simply the oldest deluge account recovered from clay. It is a deluge account built entirely around the mechanics of a warning that could not legally be given, and yet was given anyway. Routed through architecture rather than through speech, aimed at a wall rather than a man, so that the letter of a divine law could be honoured while its purpose was quietly, deliberately defeated underneath it. Later, flood narratives inherit the flood, Utnapishtim's version in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Echoes some scholars trace even into the biblical account of Noah. Structurally similar warning and survival patterns turning up independently, from Deucalion's Greece to indigenous flood traditions across entirely separate continents, with no plausible line of contact between them. Almost none of these later versions inherit the wall. That omission is its own kind of evidence for why the detail mattered so much to whoever first told it, beside the Euphrates, thousands of years before anyone thought to write it down. A story interested only in miraculous rescue doesn't need a god constrained by oath, doesn't need a loophole, doesn't need architecture standing between a warning and the person it's meant to save. This version needed all three, and kept all three, across 1,000 years of copying, because the point was never simply that a man survived a flood. The point was that the first warning anyone thought to preserve was one that had to be smuggled past the very rule forbidding it. Spoken to a wall, so that a king standing quietly on the other side might live long enough to build something the water could never reach.